So, welcome back. This is part 3 of our lecture series on the origins of Islam. In the first part, we looked at the Arabian context that exists prior to the life of Muhammad and during the life of Muhammad. The second part, we looked at the life of Muhammad and what his teachings were like in its original state and how it related to the cultural and religious milieu of the time. This third part, we want to examine the question of when does the reform movement become a separate religion? That is, when does it become Islam, right? And so if we think about the questions we've asked, when did the movement that Muhammad began, what did the movement of Muhammad look like? It was an ecumenical reform. The second question is, why does the movement succeed? And this is both a religious and a political question, right? Because we know that there are conquests here by Arab peoples. And so the nature of the victory here is really important, that we see the spread out from Mecca, Medina, starting in about 634, the conquests that move into both areas. The Byzantine Empire, which you see here on the left, and the Persian Empire on the right. The Persian Empire will fall by 636. Great parts of the Byzantine Empire, Egypt, Palestine, Syria by 641. About half of what exists as the Roman Empire will fall by 641. That's two major changes, right? And it's always pointed to as one of the major upheavals in the world, right? And really kind of maybe moves us from the ancient to the medieval period. Why does it happen so quickly? Well, part of the answer is that the Byzantines and the Persians have been fighting first a Cold War and then a hot war for the last 100 years, right? Battles back and forth really since about 613 till 630 constantly. Right, just 27 years, I can do math, of constant warfare back and forth that left both of them weakened and decimated. And so the Arab armies find not the Roman Empire at its height, not the Persian Empire at its height, but both of them in a weakened state and are able to conquer them quickly. But if we think about why does this succeed from a non-military perspective, well, there are reasons. And we could point to a few things. First, we should remember, right, that the leader of this movement is not called the caliph yet. That is a term that is applied retroactively much later. Rather, the term that we find in the earliest sources is Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the believers. And it speaks to that idea of believers being the important subset here. Within the sources of the Armenian, the Syriac, the Coptic sources, we find the believers referred to as the sons of Hagar or the sons of Ishmael, fitting into a pre-existing framework from the Hebrew Bible. They're never called Islam. They're never called Muslims, right? There's no sense even as true religious separation yet. What we do find is a shared sense of religious wonder. Right, a belief in the apocalypse, a belief in the coming end of days that is not necessarily designed to be brought on by the believers or to be fulfilled by the believers, but that they're all experiencing that together. Maybe the best example of this shared, because people question how much sharing is really going on. The best example comes from Damascus in this, which is the Great Mosque of Damascus. But if you visit the Great Mosque of Damascus, what you'll find is the shrine of the head of St. John the Baptist. Right, which we see noted on this layout, which people wonder, why is this in a mosque? And it's because it was formerly a Christian church. It was a cathedral. And this is not a like seizing of a space and making it a mosque. Rather, it is shared for almost 100 years in Damascus. Believers would come on Friday and pray. Christians would come on Sunday and pray, and they would share the space. Over time, it is converted fully into a mosque, and the Muslim government builds a church nearby, but the shrine of John the Baptist stays. And that's because they're performing the same prayers. Right? We don't think about this today because we view Muslims as praying differently with prayer mats and kneeling on the floor, but that would have been the same way that Christians prayed in the 7th century. In fact, and this is maybe mind-blowing, other than the day of the week, how would you have told a Christian from a Muslim? They come from the same ethnic groups, they dress the same, they pray the same, they both give alms, they both fast. Other than the Friday versus Sunday, they look alike. Even if we look at the description from Christian sources, we find that the way Christians describe these people, right? The Patriarch of Iraq in 648 says, not only do they not fight Christianity, they even commend our religion, show honor to the priests and monasteries and saints of our Lord, and make gifts to the monasteries and churches. A monk from 687, Jambhar Pinke, says, every year their raiders went to far-off countries and islands and brought back captives from every people under heaven. But from everyone they only demanded tribute. They allowed each to remain in whatever faith they wish, there being not a few Christians among them, some aligned with the heretics and some with us. And this speaks to one of the really remarkable facts of this conquest. It is not a religiously defined one. The believers' movement is open still. We can call it ecumenical in the sense of it brings in people from different beliefs and does not require them to give up those beliefs so long as they adhere to a same central principle, one God. This quote also reflects the fact there is no compulsion, right? There is no requirement of conversion. Instead, there is slow adoption. And this is something that we have a hard time, thinking. We assume that the Near East, the Middle East is just Muslim overnight. Reality, Syria doesn't become majority Muslim until probably the 10th century. Egypt does not become majority Muslim until the 14th century. That is, it's been 700 years that it is a Christian majority country under Muslim rule. In fact, Egypt has a longer Christian history than a Muslim one, even still today, right? It has been Muslim majority for 7 centuries. It was Christian majority for 10 centuries prior to that. In terms of developments within the religion itself, or what will become the religion, we should point to the first 3 so-called caliphs of Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. Caliph is, again, a misnomer. It is an anachronistic term. We should instead refer to them as the Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the believers. And we could highlight a lot of things they did, and I would encourage you to go read about this. But I would focus specifically on Umar, right, the second caliph, who said, according to tradition, the world is corrupt, but you can change it. He notes that the unity of the community, referred to as the Ummah, could only be maintained if the energies of the tribes are directed outward rather than others within the Ummah. And this is where we get the term jihad, right? But people have many, many beliefs about today, but the term simply in the original Quran means striving, pushing, that there is evil in the world. What you want to do is push it as far as possible away from you. And this is the idea of why this kind of warfare pushing out. It is not to destroy. You can't erase evil, but you can push it away and then create a civilization, a community of peace and stability within. Umar thus oversees the community when it conquers all of Persia and most of Byzantium. He creates a treasury in Medina and institutes a tax for non-Muslims. And we can note that, this is, maybe not unexpected. This is common among most conquering empires of the time. We'll also note that the tax that non-Muslims pay is less than the tax that heretics paid in the Roman Empire. That is, if you were Christian but the wrong brand of Christian, you paid a tax to the Roman Empire. If you are any brand of Christian, under the new caliphate, you pay a tax that is lower than what that tax had been before. Umar is also responsible for compiling and standardizing the Quran, for instituting a new calendar, and regulating society, introducing rules against drinking, temporary marriage, stoning for adultery, and slavery. The one story from him that I will highlight is he enters Jerusalem supposedly in about the year 640. And he goes in and is taken a tour of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is supposedly the site where Jesus is crucified, laid to rest, and rises from the dead. And then he goes to pray, and they invite him to pray there, and he says no, because eventually someone would come and want to take this from you, and so I will go out. So he goes next door and prays, and there's the Mosque of Umar. He also goes up supposedly onto what had been the Temple Mount, the site of the Jewish temple, and clears the stones away, and builds a small building there that is on the site of what is today the Dome of the Rock and Alaska Mosque to pray. And it speaks to that continued shared tradition that he is reforming what had come before. Uthman, his successor, is a member of the Umayyad clan. right, which had tried to kill Muhammad in Mecca. He founds the Umayyad dynasty. He allows Muslims to buy land and conquer territory, and he is killed by a mob of outsiders from Egypt and Damascus there to protest their mistreatment by the new government. His death provokes the first split within the community between the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, Ali, and Muawiyah, his personal secretary, at this point the governor of Syria, and the son of Hind. And I want to talk about Muawiyah for a few minutes because he is particularly important. The son of Abu Sufyan and Hind, the third cousin to Muhammad and Ali, so he's within this very closely. And there's an irony that this clan was the one that attempted to assassinate Muhammad in Mecca, that prompted him to flee the city in 622. And after their conversion, their wealth, which had been seized from those who first became Muslims and then had to leave, allowed them to dominate the new community. In 639, Muawiyah had been appointed governor of Syria by the second Caliph Umar. With limited resources, Muawiyah consolidated power as most people in the ancient world did. He married into it. He married a daughter of the Kalb tribe, a Jacobite Christian tribe in Syria. After the bubonic plague had killed much of the Muslim army in Syria, by marrying into the Jacobite Christian group, he began to use Jacobite Christians to fight for him against the Romans. With limited resources and the Byzantines over the border, Muawiyah worked in cooperation with the Christian population of Syria. And Muawiyah really represents a turning point, that he is the first one who recognizes the chance to establish a long-term government. He kept his troops in training every year. He was not just there for raiding, but for building a kingdom. Muawiyah left the Byzantine and the Persian administrative structures largely intact, being sure not to give his largely non-Muslim subjects any incentive to revolt. He opened the postal system to the public before it was just for military use. He founded a navy that was manned by Egyptian Coptic Christian sailors who were viewed as heretics by the Orthodox Chalcedonians in Constantinople. And in this way, Muawiyah takes the split within the Christian world and uses it to his advantage. Now, after the death of Uthman in 656, he and Ali both fight for control of the wider believers community. And this is known as the first fitna, the first civil war. And it's particularly interesting, but I'm not going to go in again to all the details of the military. And I encourage you to go read about this and look this up to understand a little bit more. But while they go to war, they eventually try to settle it by negotiating. And the arbitration proposed that both Muawiyah and Ali be denied the leadership and a new election held. Ali rejected this, but he was opposed by rebels from Mesopotamia that had murdered Uthman. And so they go to battle, but what happens eventually over time is that Ali is assassinated by Khazarites, right? That is by a splinter group within Iraq that did not want to see him negotiating with Muawiyah. Muawiyah was left with the largest and most organized and most disciplined force in the Near East. And so 6 months later, the son of Ali, Hassan, made a peace treaty with Muawiyah, handed over power to Muawiyah on the condition that he be just to the people and keep them safe and secure, and after his death, not establish a dynasty. And Jambar Penkei, our Christian monk, wrote that while Muawiyah reigned, there was peace throughout the world whose like we had never heard or seen, nor had our fathers or our fathers' fathers. Muawiyah governed the geographically and politically disparate regions to form what we would call the caliphate. So again, it's an anachronistic term. Really, he's the founder of the Umayyad Empire, which eventually would spread from the Iberian Peninsula in Spain to Afghanistan in the east by strengthening the power of his allies in newly conquered territories. Prominent positions in the emerging governmental structures were held by Christians, some of whom belonged to families that had served in previous Byzantine governments. And the employment of Christians was part of a broader policy of religious tolerance that was necessitated by the presence of large Christian populations in the conquered provinces, especially in Syria itself. This policy also boosted his popularity. And maybe one of the ways to highlight this is that when he becomes sole ruler in 661, and he has a coronation. It isn't in Damascus. It is again in Jerusalem, speaking to that shared religious milieu. So why did the movement succeed? It stepped into the void left by the weakened Byzantine and Persian empires. Those two, which had fought each other to the point of failure in the previous century, did not have the resources to withstand the new assault. And that's not that surprising or interesting. What is less expected is the staying power of the new movement. They founded an empire that would last for roughly 3 centuries. This is the success I'm interested in. Not winning a battle, but overthrowing an empire and founding a new one. Why is it successful in that way? Because it responds to the problems of the time. Religious violence, trade routes that are conferring power on outsiders, weakness of states, and the bifurcation of culture and economy that we talked about in the first aspect, in the first lecture. The new Umayyad Empire enforces tolerance. It recenters trade routes. Instead of moving outside, it keeps them within. It has a stronger central state. And there's no longer the bifurcation of culture and economy. Culture looking towards Rome, economy looking towards Persia. Instead, it's all looking towards Damascus and then later Baghdad. So why is the movement successful? To come back to our big question here. The weakness of states and the responses to needs of the time. It's a simple answer, right? But the details are where it gets messy, which takes us to the final question here. When did it become Islam? My answer is a little bit later, under the second civil war, the second fitna, which comes after the death of Muawiyah. Muawiyah died in 680 and was succeeded by his son, Yazid, which broke the treaty he had made with Ali's family. And so Husayn Ali, who was the grandson of Muhammad and the son of Ali, had been assassinated, and many of his supporters were killed by Yazid's troops at the Battle of Karbala in 681. This battle, though, galvanized the development of a pro-Ali party, Shi'at Ali, into a unique religious sect with its own rituals and collective memory. And you might have noticed I had that term in there, Shi'at, from which we will get Shia, Shiite. Now, I'm not going to say that the Sunni-Shia split can trace all the way back here. It projects itself backwards in many ways, but then that split won't come fully for a few centuries. But its very early origins come here. Right? For the Shia, Hussein's suffering and death became a symbol of sacrifice in the struggle for right and wrong and for justice and truth against injustice and falsehood. It also provides the members of the Shia faith with a catalog of heroic norms. This battle is commemorated during an annual 10-day period during the Islamic month of Muharram by Shia, culminating in the 10th day of the month. Following these occurrences, right, Yazid faced a second revolt from Ibn al-Zubayr, whose father had been a companion of Muhammad. And this devolves into a civil war that I'm not going to, again, get into all the details of that you can go read about. Yazid dies rather suddenly the following year. He's succeeded by his son, Muawiyah II, and then eventually by Abd al-Malik, right? Abd al-Malik is probably the person who makes Islam, right? Abd al-Malik became caliph after the death of his father Marwan I in 685 amidst the ongoing second fitna. He controlled only Syria and Egypt, with the other regions split, but within a few years he dispatched armies on a campaign to reassert Umayyad control over the Islamic Empire. And he first defeated the governor of Basra and then moved to consolidate power by battling al-Zubayr in Mecca. To do this, he creates a unity, right? He changes the coinage. You'll notice here this change in coinage this is the earliest coinage, right, which looks remarkably like Persian coinage. All through this is in the coinage that is instituted in the late 680s, that erasure of the person, right, that is replaced solely by text. The Quran is standardized, right, into one easily digested version that has a single dialect, and other versions are destroyed. The Shahada that we mentioned before, there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet, is changed in 685 under Abd al-Malik to say there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet, reasserting his piety to the teachings of Muhammad and separation from Christianity and from Judaism. Maybe the best example, and I'm not saying this is what creates Islam, but an example of the changes that happen under Abd al-Malik is the Dome of the Rock. And here you have the Dome of the Rock, and this is a group of students I took in 2019 to Jerusalem. The Dome of the Rock is built about 692 by Abd al-Malik, and it reflects a separation point from Christianity, right? It is a fascinating building. It's built on an octagonal plan that resembles Roman martyr shrines in the Palace of Diocletian in Split, Croatia. But it also brings in a clear stance. So on the inside, it has the rock that is supposedly where Muhammad ascended into heaven on his night journey that we've discussed before. But on the inscriptions around the exterior and the interior, the exterior, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, there is no God but God. He is one. He has no associates. Say, he is God the one, God the eternally one, sought by all, who begets not, nor was he begotten. Most of that is what we'd expect. There is only one God. And again, it would have been ecumenical until that last line. He begets not, nor was he begotten, which is a direct assault on the idea of the divinity of Jesus. Unless we're not sure on the interior of the dome. O people of the book, do not go beyond the bounds of your religion, nor say anything but the truth about God. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of God. His word that he committed to Mary and a spirit proceeding from him. So believe in God and his messengers. Do not say three. Refrain, it is better for you. God is only one God. Far be it removed from his transcendent majesty that he should have a son. This speaks very clearly to the idea of separation, that it is no longer possible to be Christian and to be a believer, that now they are something separate. And that's created in large part by the actions of Abd al-Malik. In an attempt to solidify his own power base within the Umayyad Empire, he appealed to the piety of Muslims that I'm the true believer. Look, those who would share with Christians, with our enemies, are not. And it shows up in the Shahada, in the Quran, in the coinage, and then in the Dome of the Rock. This is also then the moment, maybe unsurprisingly, we see the first Christian revolts against the Caliphate. And this, to me, is actually one of the most important points. Think about the fact that from 640 to 690, there are no Christian revolts. That's shocking, right? If this is a imposition of Islam and the conquest of Caliphate, why are there no Christian revolts? Because it's not that. But then in 690, it is, right? And we also start to see Christians in their writings about the rulers label them first as a heresy, and then as another religion. Abd al-Malik finally takes Mecca in 692 and consolidates the empire under his control. The Umayyads were left with control of the Near East and ability to define Islam. And they succeeded in the short term, but ultimately undermined their project and laid the seeds of their overthrow. By defining Islam more closely, they created the problem of sects which disagree. They'd be overthrown by the Abbasids, who'd be overthrown by the Fatimids, and a united caliphate would no longer exist after 945. And so the Islamic world would be in pieces as it remains today, separated into sects which argue over how to be Muslim, right? Because there is a single definition given by Abd al-Malik in 692. So when did it become Islam? Under Abd al-Malik, around 692. So to bring all this together, what I've tried to do in these three lectures is to explore three big picture questions which go to the heart of the story of Islam. I'm arguing that for its first 70 years or so, the movement which eventually became Islam was an ecumenical reform movement, not a separate religion. It did develop away from that over time to become the Islam we would recognize. There are many points we could focus on, but the one I want to emphasize is this. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leader of ISIS, was wrong. He argued for return to a pure Islam, but what he posits never existed. Islam has no pure form. It is a religion in flux, which need not look any way. It has the ability to change and develop like any other religion. Likewise, we should not see it as static, as fixed, or necessarily backwards, as it is sometimes portrayed by Western media. What Islam is today represents choices of Muslims today, not any essential thing it must be perceived as. So if you're interested in this, I have a few reading suggestions of books that have come out recently on the Sasanian Empire, The Making of the Medieval Middle East by Jack Tanous, which deals very heavily with the Christians of the region, and then Fred Donner and Robert Hoyland's works, which talk about the conquest. If you would like to reach out, by all means, do that. And thank you very much for watching.